And we're live. Alright. Hello everybody, it is 3:30, which of course means it is time for one of our daily afternoon STEM shows here at the Headwaters Science Center. My name is Ryan, one of the educators here at the Headwaters Science Center. And today I have a whole kind of selection of stuff behind me. And the topic I want to talk about today is kind of an interesting one, talking about something called ossification. And so for our Latin fans out there, if you want to break that down, ossification, that OSS generally means bones. And so what we're talking about is the way that bones form and how different types of bones form. So the study of bones is osteology. So anytime you hear that OS noise, a lot of times it has stuff to do with bones. And so I'm using a couple things that I pulled from all kinds of different places all over the Science Center. Got some stuff from the basement, got some stuff from Critter Corner, got some stuff from new collection that we looked at for the first time the other day. Got some stuff from just out on the exhibit floor, and even some stuff from up in my office. In fact, the item that inspired this talk is this jar that I can't open right now, I guess, that I keep up on my desk here at the Science Center. And this was something that we were actually kind of planning on getting rid of here at the Science Center, but I rescued it from the deaccession room to keep on my desk. And the reason I picked to do that, and hopefully this comes through on the camera, is if you look really closely at this skull, you'll see there's a little hole, like right on the top in the middle of it. And that hole is really interesting because there's no bone there. And that is something that you see in a lot of juvenile animals. And this is something that is very much on display here. And like I said, you don't see juvenile animal skulls that much to actually have something like that be really easily on display. So this is from a baby deer, this is from a fawn. And that hole is kind of what I want to talk about. And so if you were to look at an adult deer skull, which actually we can. Hold on a second. You'd see that that hole is not there. There's a hole there, but that's when somebody drilled in it for the sake of making the mound. There's not that little triangular hole there in the middle. And you see that in, like I said, the juvenile forms of a lot of animals have that hole. Humans have a hole like right kind of on the top of their skull when we're born too. We actually have a few of them. If you ever hear someone refer to like the soft spot on a baby's head, that's what they're referencing. And that is something that is there. Specifically, it's there in a lot of mammals because we mammals have really, really big heads. And those heads can be challenging for mothers, for female animals, to pass during the birthing process. And so the way that we get around that is we have a lot of bones that are not quite yet bones at the time that we're born. And so we're kind of bendy, we're kind of pliable. Like when baby humans come out, when baby humans are born, a lot of times their head is almost like torpedo shaped on its way out because all the different plates of the skull that aren't very well connected kind of mush and mash together and get this little point on the top of them on their way out because that's the easiest way to actually pass that big fat human head that we have. And so as we get older, that stuff does turn into bone, it hardens, we get a lot more rigid, a lot less flexible as we get older. This is also why, like, excuse me, like so many kids, you know, as an adult, you watch like younger kids and are like, man, I feel like I would have gotten hurt if I took that fall, but that kid seems fine. And that's a product of, like I say, kids are bendy and bouncy because a lot of the parts of them are not hard and rigid yet. And so we're going to take a look at a few other things here. And so we'll start with this. Hopefully this will come through. So this is an X-ray. And this is something that normally just stays out on the floor at the Science Center, is this X-ray. We have an X-ray machine. We have an X-ray machine, X-ray viewer out on the floor, not an X-ray machine. We don't take X-rays here. We have an X-ray viewer out on the floor, and this is something that we have as part of our X-ray viewer. And the item, the reason we have it is because this is an X-ray of a young child who has swallowed a rifle casing. And so you can see right here is where the rifle casing is that this kid has swallowed, which is kind of interesting in its own right, but that's not why we're looking at this right now today. What I want to draw attention to is more down towards the bottom here, where you can see where this kid's hips are. So this is a young child, they're maybe, you know, year and a half, 2 years old probably. And what's really noticeable in this one, which is, like I said, the reason why we're showing it, is because you can maybe see there's kind of a line here. And there's one on this hip too.
Alright, what's up, dude?
And what we're looking at is the hips. And so this is a fake, it's a plastic leg of an adult human. And so what we're looking at here is the end of this bone here, it's called the femur, or your thigh bone. And that line we were seeing is about right here on there. And so there's a little there's that little squiggly line, and it looks like this is like almost two separate pieces in our toddler, but it's not as an adult. It's all one big piece that just holds together. And so that's something that's a great example of a place where it starts out as an area that doesn't have bone. So where that line is actually just cartilage when you're very young, and as you get older, it hardens, and like, as you start walking more, start depending on being up on your feet more, it hardens into actual bone that actually lets you stand up. This is part of the reason, this goofy hip alignment that babies have is part of the reason why they have a hard time walking when they're very young. It's because they literally just don't have enough rigidity in their hips to actually do it. And like I said, as you get older, you get bone that forms from either end of it. So the stuff that makes the bone kind of is in the middle of your bones. Long bones have a lot of this. And there's also a little bit in the head here. So when you start seeing the fusion happen, it starts happening from both sides, and they kind of meet in the middle here. And fuse to make one bone. But on the skull end of things, you don't get quite the same, like, really clean connection. Like, if you look close at this, and like I say, granted, this isn't real bone, but there's not a really easy spot you can look at and say, yeah, that's where these two separate things were. I mean, there's a little bit of a line there. But if you look at something like a skull, and again, hopefully this shows up on the camera, you'll see it's covered in all these kind of little zigzaggy lines. So, and you can see this one well because it's kind of splitting apart there. But these are called sutures. And so these are where different plates of the skull, so everywhere you're seeing a suture is a divide between two bones, two plates that make up the skull. And so everywhere where there's a suture is a spot. Most of the places where there's a suture is a spot where this was two separate bones that were not originally connected but grew together and end up just being kind of friction fit together is how all this sticks together. Like I said, there's a reason it's a very zigzaggy, very rough line, because that helps it stay together. If it was just a nice smooth line, it would just fall apart. Like I said, all the extra surface area of having it be zigzaggy is what keeps it stable. And so this is what we're looking at right now is actually a bear skull. But you can see this on the skulls of all sorts of animals. Human skulls have them all over the place. You can see it on our gazelle, shows them pretty well here too. There's a nice big one right down the middle. Suture. And it's not a thing that exists exclusively on skulls. You can see a same type of thing used actually in a lot of places. And so you can look at these two bones here. I can actually do that exact same thing where I can wedge these together. Like I said, they friction fit together just like that. And so what these are actually ribs, and these are ribs from a snapping turtle. So a turtle's shell is made up mostly of its ribs, and like I said, they fuse together, they suture together in such a way that it basically works as one big piece, like I said, in very much the same way that our skull does. And then they grow skin and keratin on the outside of it. Yeah, and so these I actually took from the touch table upstairs, so you can check these out when you come and visit us. It's up by the bathrooms upstairs. There's a table with all sorts of stuff you can touch, and these are on there. And I noticed these as I was setting up and thought that would be an interesting thing to look at, is how these two pieces fit together so well as a suture. There's also places where bone forms later sort of as a product of usage, I guess would be a good way to describe it. So like a common myth, sometimes you'll hear about babies, that babies don't have kneecaps, for example. They don't have a patella. And that's sort of true. Babies do not have a bone here, but babies do actually have a piece of cartilage here. And so as the baby, again, starts moving around, gets up and starts walking, and as the patellar tendon, which is not on here, but there's a tendon that goes over the top here, they start bending their knees more, they start working it more, that tendon kind of rubs up against here, And that rubbing is ultimately what triggers it to start ossifying or turning into bone. And so when you're really, really young, like I said, it's just a little piece of cartilage here. And again, that's part of the reason why babies are so wobbly on their feet, is because they, you know, they're wobbly, like their literal skeleton is wobbly at that point. And it's only once they start using it in the ways that we humans like to use our skeletons that they really start developing normal skeletons. And so yeah, the babies have kneecaps, don't have kneecaps thing is sort of true, but sort of not. Like I said, there's a structure there. It exists. Like the bone doesn't just come out of nowhere, but it isn't until they're a few years old. You know, this is something that's usually completely ossified by the time you're maybe 5 or 6 years old. Usually like school age is about when you associate the patella as being completely ossified over. The other spot that has a lot of these bones actually that work in a very similar way is your wrist. So your wrist is kind of a cool structure in and of its own right, and our model one is not in great shape here. We've lost a lot of the hand, but the wrist itself is intact, which is what we care about here. And so the wrist is actually made up of a whole pile of little bones, and that's what gives it its flexibility. Anytime you have an area that's really flexible, you know, that's usually a product of having a lot of bones there, a lot of small bones. And the wrist is interesting because, like I said, it's an area that, again, has a lot of connective tissue moving through it. You ever hear of like carpal tunnel? That's an inflammation of the connective tissue that's running through your wrist here, because there's, like I said, a lot of it, and it can get inflamed if you overuse it. But there's a couple of these bones, too, that form in a very similar way to the patella, where there's like a little bit of cartilage that exists there, but as you start using your hands and wrists and all that rubbing starts to happen, basically it turns into bone, it hardens and turns into bone. And so I think it's this one is like the main one that you hear about. It's called Pisiform, is the bone that, like I said, largely is, for the most part, like not there as bone when you're born. And as you get older and start using your wrists more normally, it hardens, calcifies, ossifies into bone. So there's little things like that all over your body. Like I said, it tends to be in like joints because, you know, it's stuff where movement's happening. The other thing I wanted to talk about, actually, one more spot. We briefly talked about ribs already because we talked about snapping turtle ribs. But ribs are kind of cool in that they are like basically the last thing in humans that really starts to ossify. So ossification is something that doctors and anthropologists can use to guess ages on people because it tends to happen at a pretty regular basis. Like you can, if you know what you're doing, you can look at those hips on that toddler and say, oh, that kid is between 18 and 22 months old. Because like I said, it happens at a relatively consistent basis. And this ossification process is something that is continuing throughout your entire life. Like I said, in particular, the ribs are something that is continually ossifying pretty much right up until you die, where our ribs are bone, but there is a whole lot of cartilage in the middle. We have our sternum, that is bone, and then we have ribs that attach to our back that start coming around that are bone. But then everywhere kind of from here over generally is going to be cartilage. That's because it is flexible. It's what lets us like inhale and exhale, is having that little bit of bendiness to that the cartilage allows for. But like I said, as you get older and older and older, it kind of creeps in from the sides and gets more and more ossified. So they become more hard, but also less flexible. And so if you ever take like CPR training, one of the things that they'll tell you about is that like particularly with older people, with seniors, be prepared to break some of their ribs when you're doing CPR, just because they said they're not flexible in the same way that a younger person's ribs are. And so, like I said, eventually it would get all the way to your sternum and have a full bone rib cage. I don't know exactly like what the rate is on it, if there is like a point that it actually fully happens that's like reasonable to happen within a human lifespan. Like I said, I know it is something that generally continues pretty much forever in humans, is that rib cage continually ossifying. And so that's one place where like even as an adult, like I'm 30 right now, about to turn 31 next month, and I'm pretty much done growing. Like I'm not going to be getting any taller. I'm not like gaining new bone in my long bones that are like extending me out anymore. But there's still parts of my body where I'm not fully developed, where I'm still, like I said, changing internally. Like I said, even on the skeletal level, like I said, things like the rib cage. The last thing I wanted to talk about, and honestly this is kind of an excuse to get some of our new collection stuff involved in this, but I wanted to talk a little bit about horns and antlers. And so, for those of you who haven't watched in a little while, we got a whole big new collection of all these taxidermied animal heads and antlers and skulls and stuff like that. Somebody brought in a whole pile of new stuff. And so, a few of the things that we have behind me, so that deer head that I brought up earlier, this impala, this deer skull, and then this bison are all from this new collection that really has not debuted out on the exhibit floor yet. So this is not quite a first look, but like a second look for the general public. And what's cool about this is it has a whole bunch of animals in it that have horns. And like I said, I think what I want to talk a little bit about here is what's different between horns and antlers. And so around northern Minnesota, the animals that we encounter have antlers. So white-tailed deer being the most prominent, obviously, but things like moose have antlers as well. Elk, we don't have them around here anymore, but we used to. They have antlers. All the deer family ones have antlers. But there also are animals that have horns, and I know there's sometimes people will use antler and horn interchangeably, but actually for biologists they mean pretty different things. And so horns you tend to see more on things that are more closely related to cows, basically. It's kind of a good way to think about it is if it's more deer related, it's got antlers. If it's more cow related, it's got horns. Is not a perfect rule, but it's pretty close. And so, like I said, the impala here has horns. And I said if you ask somebody to like describe what the difference is, usually the thing that they'll tell you is that stuff with antlers usually sheds their antlers every year, whereas stuff with horns keeps it year-round, which is generally true. But there's also some pretty important just like structural differences that I want to talk about here. And so we'll start with antlers. And antlers are interesting in that antlers technically are bone. Like they don't look a whole lot like bone. I mean, you can see there's bone right there, and you can definitely see where the difference is between where the horn or where the skull is and where the antler is. But a lot of what you're seeing as far as like how different this looks is a product of how the deer tend to use their antlers, where it's a lot of rubbing and marking and polishing, and so they get worn down and kind of get this like sheen to them that is a product of like I said, like rubbing on trees and stuff like that, is where a lot of this difference comes from. And so the way that deer antlers work is male deer are born with these little nubs already on their skull. Like they're under the skin when they're first born. They have this little bone kind of nub there that kind of is a little flat platform. And then every breeding season, basically, when they start getting hormones pumping through them, it triggers these extra bony protuberances to start growing out. And so what you'll see is they'll first have velvet on them. So velvet is this soft tissue that is on the antlers when they're growing that feeds blood and nutrients into them as they're growing. And so you'll have the bone in there, and then it's skin that's on the outside that has blood vessels in it. And until the antlers it's there until the antlers stop growing, and then once breeding season actually starts, the velvet dies, and then they rub it off on the trees, and then you have the exposed antler underneath it that then use mostly to fight with other male deer over breeding rights. Like I said, this is bone that's under here. I mean, if you take a deer's antler when it still has the velvet on it, if you were to snap that antler off and cut it open, you'd find that it's a lot softer under there. It's made up of what we would call spongy bone, which is the bone that is like inside of our long bones is what we'd call spongy bone. And then as like shortly before the velvet gets ready to come off, it kind of compacts together and turns into this harder bone that feels, like a normal bone, basically. It's just a little kind of polished up because they rub them on trees so much, basically. And like I said, they lose these every year, but they keep these little bony pads on the top of their skull all the time. With horns, it's a little different because most of what you're seeing here is not actually bone. So up here, the black part is actually made of what's called keratin, which we talked about briefly when we were talking about the turtle shell. But it's actually made of the same stuff that like your fingernails are made out of. It's made of the same stuff that like hair is made out of. It's all the same stuff. And so there is bone in here, but it's only just like a little bit on the inside, and then the horn grows on top of it. So there's a little core of bone in there, and then you have basically you can almost think of it as like a fingernail that's growing over the top of it. And so the difference as far as the antler versus horn thing goes is the horns stay on year-round for the most part. Pronghorn antelope are kind of weird in that they shed the keratin part, but they do still keep the bone part even after they shed it. And they'll continually grow year-round. Like I said, for the deer, it's a seasonal thing, but for stuff that has horns, it just keeps growing and growing and growing and growing for their entire lives. And so, kind of a cool thing that we have here is a disconnected horn. And I think this is from either a cow or a bison or something. But you can see we have the keratin, the sheath. But if you can look in there and see, you know, this is bone in here. You can actually, this is separated out, and you can actually see where the bone part of the horn is relative to, the sheath that grows over the top of it. Like I said, this stays more or less like this all the time, and then this kind of keeps growing basically forever throughout the animal's entire life. And the connection between like this hunk of bone and the skull is a little different too. It kind of is, it's not connected to the skull initially, and that's one of the big differences too, whereas like that bony platform that like a deer's antler grows off of is straight up just a part of the skull. Whereas with the horns, it's something that, it's a separate bone that grows and then fuses, basically. It's kind of similar to, like I said, like how our hips fuse together is how the horn fuses onto the skull of the cow or bison or whatever. And, like I said, just because I pulled it out, you can see there's not a whole lot of horned animals in the Americas. Like I said, we got pronghorn antelope, but otherwise, as far as wild animals go, we're basically looking at bison. And so you can maybe see, if we pull the hair back, how it actually kind of is connected in there. And like I said, you can see how like fully kind of separated the sheath part is from the actual like head here. Like there's fur like underneath it. It's like not connected to the actual skull at all, the actual sheath part of the horn. And that's pretty typical. So, did I use everything? Oh no, I got one more thing. Not all animals have bone fusion happen in all the same places the exact same way. And so one of the places you'll hear us talk about this a lot is with snakes. And so one of the unique things with snakes, kind of like the defining physical features of snakes, is the way that their jaw is situated. And in particular, what's unique with them is that their jaw doesn't fuse in the middle like ours does. And so we have a suture in the middle of our jaw. One of those squiggly, zigzaggy, friction-fit lines is in the middle of our jaw, because it's two separate bones that, like I said, suture together. But with snakes, that's actually not the case. They have two separate bones like we do, but rather than having them come together and get sutured together and friction fit in the middle, they just keep them separate all the time. And that's part of what enables snakes to be able to open their mouth as big as they can and swallow food as big as they can, is that they stay stretchy and pliable and wiggly in their mouth parts for their entire lives. Like I said, they have basically the same setup that like the lower body of a baby has, where it's like, this is too soft and squishy to be strong enough to walk, but that's like their entire mouth. And so, like I said, it gives them a lot of flexibility, but it gives them a lot of not strength. Gives them very little strength. They can't bite very hard. They can't use their mouths the same way that a lot of other animals use their mouths, because it's so, like I said, weak and flimsy and flexible. And we're not going to be able to get a good angle into this mount on it, but it is actually visible on this mount. And so this is something that is in Critter Corner. So if you come and visit the Headwaters Science Center, go over in Critter Corner to see the snake skeleton, and you can get a closer look at this. But I think that's enough about ossification, enough about bones and fusing and all that. So thank you guys for watching. The Headwaters Science Center is open. We're open 7 days a week right now. Monday through Saturday, we are open from 9:30 until 5 p.m. Sundays, we are open from 1 to 5, so swing by after lunch on Sundays. If you're somebody who is looking to avoid being here when there's a big crowd here, there's no better time than weekdays during the fall to do it. It's our lowest traffic time of the year, like by far. So like I said, if maybe you've been thinking maybe you want to come visit, but are like, ooh, COVID, I don't want to be around a bunch of people, or just, ooh, I don't want to be around a bunch of people because loud or whatever, now's the time to do it, so swing by. If you happen to come by around 3:30, a lot of times we will be doing one of these shows. Sometimes out on the floor, sometimes less out on the floor. But a lot of times, like I said, if we're out doing one, I'm always happy to have a live audience that's here to watch and interact with. I think that's always fun. But yeah, thank you guys for watching, and what's tomorrow? Tomorrow is Sunday, so it's going to be Spencer's show. I've said that